In 1828, a fur trapper named James Beckworth got separated from his brigade in the Wind River Mountains during a blizzard that lasted 9 days. He had no supplies, no fire steel, no horse. When his companions found him, he was chewing strips of rawhide from his own moccasins and boiling pine bark in a tin cup. He survived. That bark soup is number 11 on this list. Number 17 was so revolting that one trapper called it the most delicious thing God ever put on earth. Number 4 kept entire brigades alive through Rocky Mountain winters that killed grizzly bears. These 25 meals were not invented by chefs. They were invented by desperate men, freezing to death above the tree line, eating things modern Americans would not feed a dog. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten meals that kept mountain men alive when winter tried to kill them. Number 25, parched corn. Before a trapper headed into the mountains each fall, he packed one thing above all else: parched corn, dried kernels roasted in a skillet until they turned dark and hard as pebbles, then poured into a leather possibles bag. A man could carry 2 weeks of survival in a pouch the size of his fist. You chewed it slowly, one kernel at a time, grinding it between your molars until the starch released and your mouth filled with a warm, nutty sweetness that quieted the hunger long enough to keep moving. Meriwether Lewis wrote that parched corn was the most portable and sustaining food he had encountered. Fur companies issued it by the pound. It cost almost nothing, weighed almost nothing, and kept a man walking when everything else ran out. Number 24, beaver tail. The beaver was the whole reason mountain men existed. They trapped them by the thousands for the fur trade. But the meat mattered just as much when winter closed in. The tail was the prize, a flat, paddle-shaped slab of fat and cartilage covered in scaly skin that looked like something from a reptile. You held it over the fire until the skin blistered and peeled away, revealing dense white fat. Underneath that tasted somewhere between pork belly and the richest butter you have ever eaten. Mountain men roasted beaver tail directly on coals, sliced it into strips, and ate it with their fingers. The fat content was extraordinary. In temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, calories meant survival. A single beaver tail delivered enough fat to keep a man's body burning through a long, frozen night. Jim Bridger reportedly said a man who had beaver tail and coffee wanted for nothing. Number 23, jerked venison. Every mountain man carried strips of dried deer meat in his kit the way a modern hiker carries granola bars, except jerky could last through an entire winter without spoiling. Venison was sliced thin against the grain, rubbed with salt if you had it, then hung on wooden racks over a low smoky fire for 2 or 3 days, until every trace of moisture was gone. The finished product was dark, hard, and almost brittle. Chewing it was work, but a pound of good jerky contained enough protein to sustain a man through brutal physical labor in sub-zero cold. Trappers stuffed it into every pocket, every pouch, every fold of their bedroll. When a blizzard pinned you inside a snow shelter for 3 days, jerky was the difference between waiting it out and dying in it. When a hunting party brought down a buffalo in late autumn, the tongue was claimed first. Not the hump, not the ribs, the tongue. A buffalo tongue weighing 4 or 5 pounds was dropped into a pot of boiling water and simmered for 3 hours until the thick outer skin peeled away, revealing tender, rich meat that practically dissolved on the tongue. The flavor was beefy but sweeter, almost delicate compared to the tougher cuts. At the Great Fur Trade Rendezvous of 1832, smoked tongues were traded alongside whiskey and gunpowder as luxury goods. In winter camps, boiled tongue stretched further than roasted because the broth itself became a meal, rich with gelatin and fat that warmed a man from the inside out. Number 21. Rubaboo. This was the everyday stew of the fur trade, the meal that appeared around every campfire from Hudson Bay to the Missouri headwaters. Rubaboo was pemmican broken into chunks and boiled in water with whatever else was available. Flour if you had it, wild onions if you could find them, sometimes nothing else at all. The pemmican dissolved into the boiling water, releasing rendered fat and shreds of dried meat that turned plain water into a thick, greasy, deeply savory broth. French-Canadian voyageurs who paddled fur trade canoes called it the staple of the Pays d'Anjou, the upper country. They ate it twice a day and worked 18-hour shifts on it. The consistency was somewhere between porridge and gravy, thick enough to coat a wooden spoon. Seasoning was salt if you had it, and nothing if you did not. A pot of rubaboo made from a single pound of pemmican could feed 3 men, and it reheated over coals the next morning, tasting exactly the same. It was ugly, monotonous, and absolutely essential. Men who wintered in the mountains without pemmican for rubaboo often did not come back. Number 20. Roasted marrow bones. When mountain men killed an elk or a buffalo, they cracked the leg bones open before anything else. The marrow inside was a soft, fatty, almost custard-like substance. It was scooped out with the point of a knife and eaten raw or roasted over coals until it bubbled and turned golden. The taste was rich and buttery, with a faint mineral edge that told your body exactly what it was getting. Pure, concentrated fuel. In deep winter, when a man might burn 6,000 calories a day just staying warm, marrow was medicine. Trappers propped split bones upright around the fire and let the marrow slowly render, catching the drippings on pieces of flat bread, or simply tilting the bone back and drinking it like soup. Nutritionists now sell bone marrow as a superfood for $30 a jar. Mountain men cracked it out of a femur with a hatchet and ate it while squatting in the snow. Number 19. Prairie turnip. The Lakota called it tipsine. French trappers called it pomme blanche. Mountain men called it whatever would get them through another day. This starchy root grew wild across the Great Plains and into the mountain valleys. Indigenous women harvested it by the bushel in late spring, braiding the roots and drying them for winter. Peeled, sliced, and boiled in water, it produced a starchy, slightly sweet broth that thickened stews and filled stomachs when meat was scarce. Ground into flour, it could be mixed with water and fried into dense cakes on a hot rock. A leather bag of dried prairie turnip weighed almost nothing and lasted through an entire winter. When game vanished during the hardest months, this humble root was sometimes the only thing between a mountain man and starvation. Number 18. Raw liver. This is the one that separates the mountain men from everyone who came after. When a fresh kill was made, especially buffalo, the liver was pulled from the carcass steaming and eaten immediately. Raw, sometimes still warm from the animal's body heat, mountain men sliced it with their belt knives and chewed it standing over the carcass, blood running down their chins and freezing in their beards. The taste was metallic, rich, and intensely mineral. But they were not eating it for the taste. They were eating it because their bodies screamed for the vitamins that months of dried meat and fat could not provide. Liver is one of the most nutrient-dense foods on Earth, packed with iron, vitamin A, and B vitamins that prevent the kind of deficiency diseases that killed men slowly through long winters. The Crow and Blackfoot peoples practiced this for centuries, and mountain men who lived among them adopted the habit. Trappers who refused to eat raw organ meat developed symptoms of scurvy and night blindness. Those who swallowed their squeamishness and ate the liver did not. Number 17, boudins. Here is the dish that made Eastern journalists recoil and made mountain men fight over second helpings. Boudins were buffalo intestines, cleaned just enough to remove the worst of the contents, then roasted directly over an open flame until the casing charred and crisped, while the lining inside turned soft and almost creamy. Some trappers did not clean them much at all. The partially digested grass inside gave the boudins a bitter, herbaceous flavor that men either loved or tolerated because they had no choice. Osborne Russell, who spent 9 years trapping in the Rockies, wrote that roasted boudins were considered the greatest delicacy of the mountains. Men pulled them from the fire in long ropes and ate them hand over hand like sausage links, burning their fingers and not caring. The fat content was enormous. The taste was smoky, rich, and unlike anything in civilized cuisine. This was the meal that defined the mountain man. Not because it was good by any standard you would recognize, but because eating it meant you had crossed a line that most people never would. If you want a full collection of hearty, old-fashioned meals like these, I put together a cookbook with 100 simple recipes. The link is at the top of the description. Number 16, pine needle tea. This was not a meal. It was survival medicine disguised as a hot drink. Mountain men stripped handfuls of green pine needles from whatever evergreen was closest, crushed them between their palms, and steeped them in boiling water for 10 minutes. The result was a pale green liquid that tasted sharp, resinous, and vaguely like turpentine. But it contained more vitamin C per cup than orange juice, and on the frontier, vitamin C meant the difference between keeping your teeth and watching them fall out one by one. Scurvy killed men in the mountains just as surely as it killed sailors at sea. The symptoms started with bleeding gums and fatigue, and ended with death if nothing changed. Native peoples across the continent knew that pine needle tea prevented this. French voyageurs learned it from them in the 1600s. Mountain men learned it from the voyageurs. A man who drank a cup every day through winter came out the other side with his health intact. A man who did not might not come out at all. Number 15, pemmican. If any single food made the Western fur trade possible, it was pemmican. Lean meat, usually buffalo, was dried until brittle, then pounded into shreds and mixed with an equal weight of rendered fat. Dried berries were folded in when available. The mixture was packed into rawhide bags called parfleches and sealed with melted tallow. A 90-pound bag could sustain a man for months. It did not spoil. It did not freeze solid. It could be eaten raw, sliced like a loaf, or boiled into rubaboo. The calorie density was staggering, roughly 3,500 calories per pound. The Hudson Bay Company purchased tens of thousands of pounds annually from Métis and Indigenous suppliers. Mountain men who had pemmican survived. Those who ran out faced a winter of increasingly desperate improvisation. Every meal below this one on the list exists because the pemmican ran out. Number 14, boiled rawhide. When everything else was gone, mountain men boiled their own equipment. Rawhide, the untanned skin of buffalo or elk, was cut from parfleche bags, moccasin soles, even saddle rigging, and simmered in water for hours until it softened into a gelatinous, rubbery mass that could be chewed and swallowed. The taste was almost non-existent, faintly animal, faintly smoky. The texture was like chewing a thick rubber band that slowly gave way. But rawhide contains collagen, and collagen becomes gelatin when boiled, which means it delivered some actual nutrition to a starving body. Multiple trapper journals from the 1830s record entire brigades surviving for weeks on boiled rawhide and melted snow. It was the bottom of the barrel. The meal that said things have gone terribly wrong, but you were still alive enough to complain about it. First pattern break. Here is what modern survivalists get wrong about mountain men. They imagine rugged individuals conquering the wilderness alone. The truth was grimmer and more communal. Mountain men survived winter by staying close to indigenous communities who had been thriving in these mountains for thousands of years. The Shoshone, the Flathead, the Nez Perce did not just survive winter. They had engineered entire food systems around it. Drying racks, underground storage pits, seasonal migration patterns that followed game herds. Trappers who married into these communities had dramatically higher survival rates than those who tried to winter alone. The meals on this list are not just mountain man inventions. Most of them are indigenous technologies that white trappers adopted because the alternative was death. Number 13, camas root. In the mountain valleys of present-day Idaho and Montana, fields of blue camas flowers marked underground treasure. The bulbs, dug in late summer and slow roasted in earth ovens for up to 3 days, turned from starchy and bland to dark, sweet, and almost caramel-like. Mountain men who wintered with Nez Perce bands ate camas as a staple starch, the way settlers back east ate potatoes. Dried camas cakes could be stored for months and reconstituted in soups throughout the winter. The taste after roasting was surprisingly sweet, nothing like what you would expect from a plain white root pulled from the dirt. Mountain men who spent years in the Rockies ate camas alongside dried fish and jerky, building meals from the same ingredients native peoples had combined for generations. Number 12, bear grease and meat. When a mountain man killed a bear in late autumn, the fat was worth more than the meat. A single black bear could yield 40 pounds of rendered grease that stayed soft and spreadable even in cold weather. That grease went into everything, smeared on dried meat to add calories, melted into stews for richness, spread on flat bread like butter. Bear meat itself was roasted or boiled and eaten in enormous quantities when available. The flavor depended entirely on what the bear had been eating. A bear fattened on berries tasted sweet and mild. A bear that had been eating fish tasted like something you would rather forget. Mountain men learned to check the stomach contents before committing to a meal. Number 11, pine bark soup. This was the meal James Beckworth survived on, and he was not alone. When starvation pressed in, mountain men stripped the inner bark, the cambium layer, from pine or cottonwood trees. This thin, pale layer between the rough outer bark and the hardwood contained enough starch and sugar to sustain life. They scraped it off with a knife, cut it into strips, and boiled it for hours until it softened into a gummy, slightly sweet mass, suspended in pale broth. The taste was woody, faintly resinous, and deeply unsatisfying. But it stopped the stomach cramps of starvation and provided just enough energy to keep moving. Indigenous peoples across the West ate cambium as a regular supplement, not just a desperation food. They dried it, ground it into flour, and baked it into cakes. Mountain men only reached for it when everything else had failed, but the fact that they knew about it at all saved lives. Number 10, dried buffalo meat stew, second pattern break. When a brigade made a big fall kill, the women in camp, often indigenous wives of the trappers, spent days cutting meat into thin sheets and drying it over low fires. That dried meat was packed into rawhide cases and cached in trees or buried in marked locations for the winter months ahead. When needed, chunks were broken off and boiled in water with dried prairie turnip, wild onions, or dried camas until everything softened into a thick, dark stew that smelled like smoke and tasted like survival. This was not a quick meal. The dried meat took hours to rehydrate and soften, but the process was unattended. You built your fire, hung your pot, and waited while the mountain wind howled outside your shelter. By evening, the stew was ready, and the whole camp gathered around the fire to eat from a shared pot. A single cache of properly dried meat could feed a small group through the worst months. Number 9. Tripe stew. The stomach lining of buffalo or elk was not waste. It was Wednesday dinner. Mountain men washed the tripe in creek water, cut it into strips, and boiled it with whatever else was on hand. After hours of simmering, the texture became soft and slightly chewy, with a mild flavor that absorbed whatever it was cooked with. French-Canadian trappers, who made up a significant portion of the mountain fur trade, had grown up eating tripe in Quebec and saw nothing unusual about it. American-born trappers had to be taught, and some never made peace with the texture. But hunger is a powerful teacher, and by the second winter, most men ate tripe without complaint. Number 8. Serviceberry cakes. Serviceberries, called Saskatoon berries in the north, grew thick across mountain valleys and were harvested in midsummer by the bushel. Indigenous women dried them in the sun, then pounded them flat into dense cakes that could be stacked and stored for months. These cakes were the closest thing to fruit a mountain man would taste between September and May. Eaten alone, they were chewy, sweet, and faintly tart. Crumbled into stews or mixed with pemmican, they added a brightness that cut through the monotony of meat and fat. The vitamin content helped prevent deficiency diseases during the long months when nothing green grew. A stack of serviceberry cakes tucked into a parfleche bag was a luxury that made winter bearable in a way that meat alone never could. Number 7. Roasted buffalo hump. The hump of the buffalo, that massive mound of muscle and fat above the shoulders, was the single most prized cut in the mountain man's world. Roasted over an open fire, the exterior charred dark while the interior stayed tender and rich, marbled with veins of fat that basted the meat from within as it cooked. The flavor was deeper and sweeter than any domestic beef, with a richness that could only come from an animal that had spent its life grazing on wild prairie grass. Mountain men who had eaten every part of every animal in the Rockies consistently ranked buffalo hump as the finest meal the wilderness could offer. At Rendezvous, a properly roasted hump rib drew men from across the camp. When a brigade killed a buffalo in winter, the hump was roasted that same night, steaming in the cold air while men carved slices with their knives and ate in reverent silence. You could not buy this in any city at any price. Number 6. Wild onion soup. Wherever mountain men traveled in the Rockies, wild onions grew in meadows and along creek banks. They were smaller than cultivated onions, sharper, more pungent, and they transformed boiled meat from bland fuel into something approaching an actual meal. A handful of wild onions, chopped and simmered in broth with whatever dried meat was available, created a soup that smelled almost domestic, almost like a kitchen. That smell mattered more than the taste. After months in the wilderness, eating food that tasted like nothing but salt and smoke, the aroma of onions simmering in a pot connected a man to every warm kitchen he had ever known. Number 5. Depouilly. The thick layer of fat that ran along the back of a buffalo, just beneath the hide, was called depouilly by the French trappers and considered the richest, most valuable fat on the animal. Cut away in long slabs and eaten raw, roasted, or rendered into tallow, depouille had a clean, almost sweet taste that distinguished it from the harder, grainier fat found elsewhere on the carcass. Mountain men ate depouille the way a modern person eats butter, as an accompaniment to everything, a calorie-dense addition that made every meal more sustaining. In winter camps, slabs of depouille were hung from lodge poles and sliced as needed. A brigade with plenty of depouille faced winter with confidence. A brigade without it faced something considerably darker. Number 4. Cached meat and fat. This was the system that kept entire brigades alive. In late autumn, after the big hunts, mountain men and their indigenous companions prepared hundreds of pounds of dried meat, rendered tallow and pemmican, then sealed it in rawhide containers and buried it in carefully marked caches along their winter route. When a brigade moved through familiar territory in January, they dug up their caches and feasted on supplies prepared months earlier. The frozen ground acted as a natural refrigerator. A well-stocked cache meant the difference between a hard winter and a fatal one. When caches were raided by wolverines or rival trappers, the consequences were catastrophic. Journals from the period record men weeping at the sight of a destroyed cache, understanding immediately what it meant for the months ahead. Number 3. Blood soup. When a fresh kill was made in winter, the blood was never wasted. Mountain men caught it in kettles as the animal was butchered, then boiled it with chunks of fat and whatever else was available. As it cooked, the blood thickened into a dark, rich broth with a deep iron flavor and a velvety texture that coated the mouth. Some trappers added strips of intestine or dried meat. Others drank it nearly straight, seasoned with nothing but salt. The nutritional value was extraordinary. It provided iron, protein, and minerals in concentrated form. Indigenous peoples across the plains had been making blood soup for centuries. Mountain men adopted it without reservation because in the middle of a Rocky Mountain winter, squeamishness was a luxury that dead men had. Number 2. Whole roasted beaver. The beaver was not just trapped for its fur. In lean times, the entire animal went onto the fire. Skinned, gutted, and spit over coals, a whole beaver roasted slowly for hours until the dark red meat turned tender and the generous layer of fat beneath the skin rendered and crisped. The meat tasted gamey, somewhere between dark turkey and pork, with a faintly sweet undertone from the beaver's diet of bark and roots. Mountain men at winter camps roasted beavers whole on rotation, one per day for a small group. The tail was always served first to the best trapper or the camp leader. The rest was divided equally. A single beaver could sustain 2 men for a full day. Number 1. Meat and fat, nothing else. Here is the truth about mountain man winter survival that no single recipe can capture. The meal that kept more men alive than any other was not a recipe at all. It was whatever meat and whatever fat were available, cooked however the fire and the weather allowed. Elk roasted on a stick, buffalo ribs charred over coals, venison boiled in a kettle. Mountain men in deep winter ate meat and fat and almost nothing else for months at a time. No bread, no vegetables, no grain, just animal protein and animal fat consumed in enormous quantities to fuel bodies burning thousands of calories a day against the cold. The human body can survive indefinitely on meat and fat alone if the fat intake is high enough. The Inuit proved this. The mountain men proved it again every winter in some of the harshest conditions on the continent. They did not have the science, they had the results. The men who ate enough fat lived. The men who did not, did not. Every meal on this list is a variation of that single brutal truth. If you want a full collection of simple, hearty meals inspired by old traditions like these, I put together a cookbook with 100 recipes. The link is at the top of the description. Here is my challenge. Look at this list and ask yourself what we actually lost when we moved indoors and started buying food wrapped in plastic. Not the discomfort, not the danger, but the knowledge that food is not entertainment. It is fuel. It is medicine. It is the thing that stands between you and the cold. Mountain men knew exactly what every bite was worth, because getting it wrong meant dying. Tell me which one you would try in the comments. I want to know if anyone is brave enough to roast boudins, or if you are all reaching for the buffalo hump. These were not just meals, they were the reason the West got explored at all.